Everyone thinks they know how to use conceptual frameworks in case interviews, but very few candidates even know what the interviewer is observing when they look at them as they spit out the business situation framework or something like that. Conceptual frameworks are the hardest type of structure to master, but they're the most important one as well. When you're dealing with strategy, and you're always dealing with strategy in consulting, conceptual frameworks are the only tool that will help you think about long-term qualitative problems. My name is Bruno, I'm an ex-McKinsey consultant and the co-founder of Crafting Cases, where we teach you how to stand out in your case interviews by thinking like a top management consultant. And in this video, I'm gonna show you the third way to be MECE, conceptual frameworks. I'm gonna show you what they are, how to use them, and what to be aware of when using them, such as, should I use a pre-made framework and adapt it, or should I build one up from scratch? Now, this video is part of a longer series of videos called the 5 Ways to be MECE. So if you just happen to want to know more about conceptual frameworks, keep watching this video. But if you want to know about all the 5 ways to be MECE, I highly recommend you start at the beginning of the playlist, which I'm gonna put it up here. So without further ado, let's jump right into conceptual frameworks. So first things first, let's see what are conceptual frameworks and let's see some examples of them. Later I'm going to show you how to use them and what are some things that you should be aware when using them. So what are conceptual frameworks? Basically, it's when you categorize a bunch of different qualitative drivers. So you get a bunch of drivers to something, qualitative ones generally, and you categorize them into conceptual structure. So broader words describing more precise words. So just one example of that, if you get Porter's 5 Forces, it's a framework on a long-term industry profitability. So how profitable is the airline industry or the retail industry and so on. And the way Porter built that is he got some drivers of industry profitability. For example, barriers to entry, switching costs of customers, concentration of suppliers, and so on. And he categorized that into 5 forces. So you have the threat of new entrants, you have the threat of substitutes, you have the bargaining power of customers and suppliers, and you have the competitiveness of your own part of the value chain. So he categorized a bunch of drivers of profitability into 5 concepts, or 5 forces in his case. Now, he could have described industry profitability as the industry's revenues minus the industry's costs. This would be an algebra structure for the same problem. It wouldn't be as insightful as doing a conceptual framework for that, because Mr. Porter was worried about strategy, about long-term effects, and you can't have numbers for the far future. So that's the first example of a conceptual framework. Then there's also other examples. For example, you get the 3 C's, customers, company, and competition, if you want to understand how likely is a company to perform well in a competitive environment. You have the 4 P's of marketing if you want to understand your tactical options when marketing a new product or a product portfolio. If you want to solve a simple organizational problem, for example, an interface between 2 departments of a company, you can use the people, process, and systems framework. I used to use that all the time at McKinsey. But you can also create your own conceptual frameworks for different problems, for different case interview problems. And the key is to break down the system, for example, the competitive market or industry's profitability or whatever system you're working with, you break it down into smaller parts, into smaller players, for example. So let's get some examples of conceptual frameworks you could build in your case interviews for specific case questions. Suppose you get a question, what should Tesla do to increase sales of electric cars? And you want to solve that with a conceptual framework. After all, it's a strategic problem. You can say that sales is quantitative, but it's hard to get data on the future of the electric car market or anything. So here's how I would break down this problem. What are customers looking for when deciding to buy a car? So I have a customers category here, which is important because I can only increase sales if I know what they want. What is the competition doing and what's their strategy so that I can retain high market share? What is within Tesla's reach to do? So of all the options, what can we actually do? Probably not every single option of them. How are Tesla's current products versus their competition? And I'd probably also look at the pipeline of products. And finally, what infrastructure changes would impact demand for electric cars? So for example, charging stations or homes with roofs that generate electricity, an idea for Elon Musk here. Anyway, I just used the 3 C's. I added the product category, which is something that a lot of people do, but I've also added an infrastructure category in this case. Why did I use the 3 C's? Because it's a competitive problem. Why did I add the other 2 categories? Products, because selling cars is a lot more about products than about the company itself in most cases. And infrastructure, because this is an industry that still doesn't have the infrastructure developed. So maybe the key to develop this industry is on infrastructure. Let's check another case for which I would not find a framework in a case interview book. How can a law firm increase the quality of its staff? So personal development in a law firm. I can't find a framework for that in a case interview book, but I can make my own. I can get a system which is the quality of a worker, of a knowledge worker, and break it down into its parts. So they can get smarter people. So that's one way to do it. They can get more experienced people. So it's not only about how smart you are, it's also about how experienced you are. They can get better educated people. So maybe people who studied at better law firms or that got more advanced degrees. They can get more motivated people. It's not just about intelligence or experience or education. It's also about how motivated you are. They can train these people better. So maybe it's not about getting better people. It's about training them to be better. Or they can also expose these people to projects that give them more experience. And just notice the typo there. But anyway, I broke down into these 6 factors, which are the ones that I found relevant. Hey Bruno, but it's also important that they're collaborative. Great, if you think that, add that to your own structure. I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm just saying that this is the framework that I built. That with stuff that I find relevant. And actually, I think collaboration is pretty important as well. Let's check another case. How would you improve a business school education? So here's how I would break it down. We can get better professors. We can get better students. We learn a lot from each other. We can get better books and materials. Maybe we're using books from authors that are not really good, for example, or we could be using more cases or whatever. We can improve our curriculum. And I noticed the other typo there as well. We can improve our extracurriculars. So this is just an example. I got an educational system of one business school and I broke it down into its elements. Now, you might also be thinking, oh, but there's also the technology or the whatever, the internships. And one thing that may be crossing your mind now is it's hard to make these structures exhaustive. We're gonna get there later. Hold on to your chair. But these are just some examples of conceptual frameworks for specific case interview problems you might face in your case interviews. Now, we do have a step-by-step process on how to get a system and break it down into its parts in our free course on case interview fundamentals. But at a high level, it's that simple. Just find out what are the parts that constitute your system. Now, Now that we understand what are conceptual frameworks and can see how a few of them look like and how they're different from each other, let's take a look at how to use them in your case interviews. The first step to use a conceptual framework is, of course, to understand if you actually want to use one or not. So if you have a problem that's not numerical, or in which you have very few numbers, or if you can't trust the numbers, for example, in a long-term problem, a conceptual framework might be a great choice because you don't need numbers to use it. You just need to work with conceptual information. And obviously you can put some numbers in it and you can use numbers together with it, but you don't need the numbers. Also, if you have a problem in which you want to understand the whole context of the situation, a conceptual framework might also be a great choice. Because in a conceptual framework, you're getting a system and you're breaking it down into the parts of the system. So you're looking at the whole problem from different angles. Now, if you have a problem in which you want to eliminate the parts that are not part of the problem as quickly as possible, so you want to get to a root cause, you want to get a big problem and reduce it to something small, then a conceptual framework is not the best choice because it forces you to look at the whole problem from different angles, and you can't really eliminate parts of it based on numbers. So if you want to eliminate parts of the problem, if you want to get to a root cause, it's better to make an issue tree out of algebra structures, process structures, segmentations, or a combination of those. However, if you want to look at the problem as a whole, which is less efficient but brings more context, then a conceptual framework might be and probably will be a great choice. Now, the second step to use a conceptual framework is to choose if you're going to create your own framework from scratch for that case, or if you're gonna pick one that you've learned somewhere or that you've memorized from somewhere. Now, I always recommend to advanced candidates that they create their own frameworks from scratch, but I get that when you're starting out, that's kind of a tall order. So what I recommend, in case you're starting out, in case you don't know how to create your own frameworks from scratch yet, or you don't feel confident doing it, what I recommend is two things. First, pick a framework that actually makes sense to use when solving that case. If you're using the 3Cs, which is a competitive strategy framework, for a public sector case, it won't make sense. And second, adapt this framework until it fits very neatly with the problem that you have. It's amazing, but so many candidates just pick a framework that does not have to do anything with the problem to start the case. And that's kind of like picking a physics equation to solve a physics problem, even if the equation has nothing to do with the problem just because it's physics, you know? Now, even the candidates who do pick a framework that have something to do with the problem, they usually don't adapt it well enough so that it really fits the problem. Now, I've made a whole video on adapting your frameworks so that they fit the problem. I'm gonna put the video up here, but what you need to have in mind is that adapting the framework well involves adding and subtracting categories, and it involves making your issues and hypotheses more specific to the problem. Which leads us to our third step on how to use conceptual frameworks, which is to fill each of your buckets, each of your categories with specific issues, specific hypotheses. Now, when you're using a conceptual framework, you're using it because you're looking for insight, for context. So conceptual frameworks, more than other types of structures, need a lot of substance in them. Otherwise, they're not going to be insightful enough. You're not going to get an offer if you're just saying, I want to analyze customers. Tell me what your customers think. You need a lot more substance, specificity, and specific issues and hypotheses. Now, this is true for every kind of framework, but it is especially true for conceptual frameworks. Now, one thing that everyone asked me when I wrote the original 5 Ways to Be MECE article was, okay, but how can I make sure that my conceptual frameworks are MECE? Glad you asked that. So, in a sense, you can't make sure that your conceptual frameworks are MECE, and that's what causes it to be the hardest type of framework to use. However, you can get very close to MECE, or as close as humanly possible, or as close as you need to be MECE. And here's how. To be mutually exclusive, to have no overlaps, you need one unifying criteria that is the same for every bucket. So for example, in the 3 C's, this criteria is what are the players in a competitive marketplace. So each player is different from the other, and the 3 buckets are players. There's the customers, the company, and the competition. Same criteria for all buckets. In the 4 P's, this criteria is what are the key tactical marketing decisions you can make. So one decision is different from the other. You have product decisions, you have pricing decisions, you have placement decisions. And because the criteria is the same, there's no overlap. In the Porter's 5 Forces, the criteria is where can profitability leak into. So you can lose profitability because your customers are getting more value, or your suppliers are raising their prices, or you're avoiding new entrants, and so on. So same criteria, that makes it have no overlaps. And a lot of frameworks that candidates make, they don't obey the same criteria, and that causes their frameworks not to be mutually exclusive. Now, this can get pretty theoretical very quickly. So to teach people how to build their own frameworks in our course, we actually teach them to use the same set of criteria for every case, for every framework. It's a set of criteria that works every time. And well, I'm not gonna go over this here because it will take too long, so more on that in our free course. But the thing is, you need to have a criteria. It doesn't matter which one, but by having a criteria, you make sure that all your buckets are different from each other. Being different from each other within the same criteria makes them have no overlaps, which means they're mutually exclusive, which means your structure is gonna be clear to understand. So now we have a criteria to make our categories, but we still need to be collectively exhaustive. So we must have no gaps. And this is the hardest part, even if it's the most important one. So you're looking for every relevant category according to your criterion. So you certainly have heard of the 4 P's of marketing, but you might have heard also of the 7 P's of marketing or the 8 P's of marketing. And when I was in business school, I always thought, well, why do they keep adding these P's? And what stands the proof of time is the 4 P's of marketing. But what about the other P's? Does that mean that the 4 P's is not exhaustive? Well, the answer is no. Even though there are other P's of marketing, the important P's, the relevant P's, are the 4 P's. So you can't be fully exhaustive in a conceptual structure, otherwise you're not being relevant. You're not being synthetical enough. So you must find all the relevant buckets. Now, how to know if a bucket is relevant or not? That involves a bit of business judgment and also some practice which you can get in our free course. So running the risk of being repetitive here, just if you want to learn how to structure from scratch, just go to craftingcases.com/free course, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised once you get there. It's free, so I'm not doing this to promote myself. It's just there's a lot of things and a lot of practice involved. So if you're interested in that, just go there. Now, a few things that you should be aware of when using your conceptual frameworks. First, make sure that using an initial tree wouldn't be better. If you have a short-term numerical problem, a problem where you want to eliminate stuff and just focus your problem solving, an initial tree is probably a better choice. just use a conceptual framework when you want to get the whole context of the things and analyze the problem from every direction. The second thing you need to be aware of is that the quality of your hypothesis matter a lot. In fact, your level of MECEness, or your perceived level of MECEness, is more related to if you've raised all or most of the relevant issues and hypotheses to whether your buckets are MECE or not. And your interviewer is going to judge if you've raised all the important hypotheses based on their experience. And because this is experience and intuition based, practice matters a lot. So if you want to get that right, you will need to practice your frameworks a lot, which is why we focus so much on examples and practice examples in everything we do in this YouTube channel, in our courses, and so on. Getting the buckets right, or the categories right, is maybe 10% of the problem, and getting the hypothesis right is 90% of the problem. And this contrasts with, for example, algebraic structures, where getting the formula right is actually the most important thing. The third thing to be aware of when using a conceptual framework is that your interviewer's perception of how good your framework was, how good your structuring abilities were, has nothing to do with your ability to pick the right framework. Instead, it has a lot to do with your ability to adapt this framework or to create one from scratch in case you've chosen to do so. Same thing, you don't judge a tailor's ability by his ability to pick the right suit from the store. Instead, you judge his ability by seeing if he can get a pretty good suit and then adapt it so that it perfectly fits you, or else by buying fabric and making a suit for you from scratch. So it's the same thing. The more important part is how you adapt your framework or build it from scratch. Obviously, it's important to pick one that's good enough so that you can adapt, but if you just pick a framework and use it, forget it. So these are the basics of conceptual frameworks, the third way to be MECE. Now I have to say that there's a lot more to learn in this topic, and I'm sorry if that disappoints you, but I don't want to be the guy who tells you that, just learn my 2 frameworks or my 5 frameworks or the crafting cases framework pack or anything like that, because I'd be lying if that worked. It doesn't work. The only way out is to learn how to actually structure your cases. And for that, there's a ton of resources. There's a playlist just for how to improve your frameworks in this channel. As I've said a few times in this video alone, there is a ton of stuff in our free course so that you can actually learn to structure your own cases and to create your frameworks. In the next video, I'm gonna show you the 4th way to be MECE, which are segmentations. Now, these types of structures are ideal to put on top of your issue trees or on top of your conceptual frameworks. I'm gonna show you how to use them so that you can spice up your structures and make them more similar to what a real consultant would do with their structures. I'm also gonna show you when not to use them and when you need to use them. So keep watching as it's the next video on this playlist. So I hope you've liked this video, and if you did, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so you can get notified when I put out a new video. And actually you have to hit the alarm bell button for that so you can get notified as well. Also, tell me in the comments if you're willing to learn how to create your own frameworks from scratch or not, and why, because I'd love to know what types of barriers or obstacles are there for candidates to create their own structures. I hope you've liked this video, as I've said, and I'll see you in the next one.